Hi students, in this video we're going to look at a paper by Ronald Dworkin titled Comment. That's obviously a very vague title. It'd be nice if it were a little bit more informative, but what it is a comment on Justice Scalia's theory of legal interpretation, which we looked at last time. So, although it's a vague title, it's relevant. He's given us some commentary on Justice Scalia's views. Before we get into that though, I want to do a little bit of review. And here you'll see that I've got some questions. And the reason I've got some questions is because this practice of retrieving information, called retrieval practice, right, is helpful in remembering or learning information. And so you need to do it with some regularity, with some breaks in between. You know, hopefully you didn't just watch the previous video and now you're watching this video. Spacing these things out is helpful. And it's helpful, right, in the same way that lifting heavy weights is helpful, right? Getting that information from the back of your brain to the front, like getting that bar from off the ground into the air or whatever, you know, however you're used to lifting, deadlifting, whatever you're doing. So bench press, whatever. So here we've got a question, and when we ask this question, right, even if you get the wrong answer, right, that effortful trying to get the right answer, if you get it wrong, that's okay. You know, what's the right answer? Go back and try it again later, right? So you don't need to get it right, but looking at your notes is not going to help you. That's easy, right? That's like lifting a 1 pound weight. Very simple to do, but lifting the 1 pound weight isn't going to help you improve. So try and remember the answers to these. Give it a good guess. If you don't, make a note of what the right answer is. Come back to the review sometime later and give it a shot. Okay. So true or false, Justice Scalia thinks that judges should give expression to subjective legislative intent. As you know, that is false. He doesn't think that. He thinks exactly the opposite. It's also sort of an interesting question, like, can legislatures even have intentions? You know, presumably individual legislators can have intentions, but can an entire legislature have an intention or intentions? That's less clear. All right, so here's another question. What's wrong with that view, according to Scalia? So pause this, right? Think about what your answer would be. You know, try and think through it. And then when you're done coming up with your answer, unpause it, see what the actual answer is. So the answer to this, there are sort of two parts. The first part is that it doesn't square with some commonly accepted rules of statutory construction. So that's one problem with the subjective legislative intent view. The other problem is that it results in people being ruled by people, by legislatures or judges, not by laws. Remember, if we're looking to legislative intent and we know what the legislative intent is, then it's the legislators that are ruling. If we look to legislative intent and we don't know what it is, then judges are just going to be making stuff up. So the judges are going to be ruling. But we don't want either of those, according to Scalia. We want the laws to be the things that are doing the ruling. And so that's a problem with the subjective legislative intent view, or what I call intentionalism. What does Scalia think judges should look to when deciding how to rule in a specific case? You can think about how would you answer that question. What's the answer there? If you know, let the tape play. If not, pause maybe. Think about how would you answer that. The answer here is that judges should look to how a reasonable person would interpret the text, right? We're looking at the text, not a broad construal, not a strict or narrow construal, but rather a reasonable construal of the text. What's this view called? Well, pretty straightforward here. It's textualism, right? We're looking at the text. We're not looking at intentions. We're looking at the text. Now as we shift to constitutional interpretation, what is Scalia's view on constitutional interpretation called, right? So he's a textualist, but he's also a, what? An originalist. So that's his view on constitutional interpretation. What does that view say? Again, you know, pause, think about what it says, try and state it in your own words, and see if you get it right. So originalism, the way I put it, is just that it's the view that the text of the Constitution should be interpreted in accordance with its original meaning, rather than its current meaning, as what the framers, what it meant, what the words meant to the framers and their audience, rather than what it means to us. What's the alternative? Right, so there's originalism, and there's what, on the other hand, it's called living constitutionalism. What's wrong with living constitutionalism, according to Scalia? Again, two-part answer. One of those, it could result in having fewer liberties than we started out with. Second, it could result in the politicization of the Supreme Court appointments, and therefore the tyranny of the majority, right? The majority is going to decide what the law is. The minority is going to have no ability to sort of have their rights protected, because if if the majority is, picking their Supreme Court justices, and the justices are ruling in accordance with what they think, then the law could potentially say, whatever it is that the majority thinks. All right. So that's the sort of background for Dworkin's paper. So what's Dworkin's thesis? Dworkin's central thesis, or central worry, is that insofar as Scalia endorses originalism, he's no longer a textualist, because he's no longer endorsing a view on which the law depends on what he calls the semantic intent, that is, the meaning of the text itself. So he's going to draw a distinction between expectation and semantic intent. We're going to look at an example of that in a second. In short, right, he thinks Scalia is being inconsistent. You can't be a textualist and an originalist at the same time, he thinks. To sort of illustrate this, he gives us an example. So suppose a boss tells his manager, without winking, right? So he's not kidding around here. He just tells the manager straight, hire the most qualified applicant for this new job. Now the boss might think it's obvious that his own son, who's an applicant, is the most qualified. Indeed, he might not have given the instruction unless he was confident that the manager would think so too. But now imagine that his son isn't the most qualified, right? So I've got this picture of Trump right with Pence here. Maybe Trump says, Pence, you're in charge of this coronavirus task force. You've got to hire the most competent person to run the testing, allocation, not allocation, but funding, how are we going to producing the tests. You've got to hire someone to be in charge of that. And he thinks maybe his son, Eric Trump Jr.? I don't know the name. Jared Kushner, right, the son-in-law or whatever. I think Jared Kushner is running something. Anyway, Trump might think it's obvious that, his son-in-law is the most qualified. Indeed, he might not have even given the instruction unless he was really confident that Pence would think that as well. So assuming that the manager knows that the boss's son is not the most qualified applicant, what should he do? Right? What should Pence do if he doesn't think Trump's son is the most qualified? On the one hand, he could do what his boss expects or wants him to do. That would be to follow his boss's expectation intent, right? The boss had an expectation for what he would do, and Pence could try and follow that. What do I think Trump expects me to do? Alternatively, he could do what his boss told him to do, which would be to follow his boss's semantic intent, right? Semantic is about words, right? Not about expectations, but about what you're saying. And so he could do what Trump told him to do, what he said he should do. Now, both Scalia and Dworkin agree. When it comes to the law, judges should follow the law's semantic intent. Shouldn't do what maybe the legislature wanted them to do, or expected them to do, wanted them to do. Just like, Pence can't be expected to read Trump's mind, right? He just needs to do what Trump tells him to do. Similarly, judges can't read the legislature's mind. They can just do what the legislature tells them to do. So consider the Church of the Holy Trinity versus the U.S. again, right? Legislators are like the boss, right? They said, don't allow corporations to hire foreign laborers, while not at all thinking that this instruction might result in corporations being punished for hiring skilled foreign laborers, right? So they just said, don't allow corporations to hire foreign laborers, not thinking that skilled people might count. Judges are like the manager, right? they just read what the legislature said. So they just got to follow the standard that the legislature laid down. Right? So they've got to punish any corporation that hires a foreign laborer, whether that labor is skilled or unskilled. It doesn't matter. You just got to look at what the instructions were. Now consider the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. This is where things get a little trickier. Right? So Scalia says that the Eighth Amendment does not prohibit capital punishment. Apparently, this is because neither the framers nor their audience thought that the Eighth Amendment prohibited capital punishment. So nobody sort of at the time of the founding, time of the Constitution, right, thought that capital punishment was cruel or unusual. They were practicing it, for heaven's sakes, right? Surely they didn't think it was cruel or unusual. They would have said something more specific to rule it out. If that's right, then it looks like Scalia seems to be looking to the expectation intent to determine what the Eighth Amendment prohibits. So what Dworkin's charge is that Scalia is thinking in terms of the kind of expectation intent, which he says he's not, we're not supposed to look in those terms. What would the framers expected us to outlaw capital punishment? I was like, no, but we shouldn't think about what they were expecting at all. We should just focus on what the words say. That's Dworkin's claim. So according to Dworkin, if we look at the semantic intent, we'll see that the Eighth Amendment may prohibit capital punishment. Right? This is because the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and because, for all we know, capital punishment might be cruel and unusual. So for Dworkin, they laid down this moral principle: don't allow anything that's cruel and unusual, and sort of left it open for future generations to reflect on, like, is this punishment cruel and unusual? So one thing Scalia is going to point out is that the Fifth and 14th Amendments describe the conditions under which the government can take someone's life, liberty, or property. And that might seem like, well, if they're giving you the conditions under which we can take someone's life, then it must be that capital punishment isn't cruel, or that it's possible to take life in a way that's not cruel. But Dworkin gives this interesting sort of thought experiment. I think this is like a really clever, nice example. It does some nice work for Dworkin. So he says, imagine this case. Some legislature enacts a law that forbids the hunting of animals that are members of endangered species, and then later imposes the special license requirement for hunting minks, as well as some other animals. Right? So it's got some law that says don't hunt endangered species, and then later it has this, like, if you're going to hunt minks, you've got to get this license. So we sort of have these two laws, and the question is, can we conclude from this that the hunting of minks is legally permitted? Now think about that. Right? Would you yes or no? If you're ready for your answer, pause it. When you're ready for your answer, unpause it. So the answer for Dworkin, can we conclude from this that the hunting of minks is legally permitted? His answer is no. Why? Because minks might be endangered. Right? It's true that there are these license requirements, but the law about no hunting endangered species takes a kind of precedence over that law. So there is some requirement for what you have to do to hunt minks, but the thought is that that law is not going to apply if it turns out that minks are endangered. So he thinks there's an analogy with cruel and unusual punishment and the death penalty and that sort of thing. So we can't conclude from the laws just described whether mink hunting is legal. It's not clear because we don't know whether mink hunting, whether we don't know whether minks are endangered. Premise 2, if we can't conclude from the laws that we just described whether mink hunting is legal, then we can't conclude from the constitutional law whether capital punishment is legal. Because although the framers say things about when we can do capital punishment, it might be that capital punishment is cruel and unusual, and therefore that's not legal, even in those cases that they laid out. So we can't conclude from the constitutional law whether capital punishment is legal. That's the argument. Whereas Scalia thinks that we can. So there's a disagreement. Now Dworkin doesn't take this argument to disprove Scalia's view. One way for Scalia to defend his view is to argue that the framers, in saying that cruel and unusual punishments are prohibited, weren't saying that whatever punishments are cruel and unusual are prohibited. Instead, they were saying that the punishments that we consider cruel and unusual are prohibited. So what they were saying is not quite what it looks like they were saying. They were saying this other sort of thing, that when they said cruel and unusual punishments prohibited, they were really sort of saying like what we consider cruel and unusual is prohibited. But according to Dworkin, if sophisticated statesmen like the framers had wanted to prohibit only those punishments that they considered cruel and unusual, they could have said that. They wouldn't have written, cruel and unusual punishments shall not be inflicted. Instead, according to Dworkin, they should have said, punishments that we consider cruel and unusual shall not be inflicted. And that would have clarified everything, right? Dworkin says. Then we would have known that it's just the ones that they consider cruel and unusual are not to be inflicted. Additionally, Dworkin notes that history has disproven Scalia's fear that living constitutionalism will lead to our having fewer liberties than we started with. So remember, this is another kind of like worry that Scalia had about living constitutionalism, and the reason he goes in for originalism is because he thinks we're going to lose our liberties. Dworkin points out those who subscribe to living constitutionalism have been champions, not enemies, of individual rights. So he lists a number of cases, or I'm not sure if he lists the cases, or I'm just going to list the cases. So he points to Brown versus Board of Education. And that case in 1954 prohibited separate but equal treatment. Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, that established the right to privacy. Roe versus Wade, we get a establishment of the right to abortion prior to the fetuses being viable. And in Obergefell versus Hodges, right, we get the establishment of this right to same-sex marriage. So these look like cases where people are getting more freedom, more liberty, not less. So he thinks living constitutionalism is actually good for liberty. It's not restrictive of it. So it seems like maybe Scalia is wrong about the thought that living constitutionalism limits liberty. Dworkin says, subject to the constraints of integrity, which require justices to keep faith with past decisions, so that you've got to act in accordance with precedent, the Constitution insists that our judges do their best collectively to construct, reinspect, and revise, generation by generation, the skeleton, freedom, and equality of concern that its great clauses in the majestic abstraction command. So we've got this, like, no cruel and unusual punishment. We've got to, like, revisit that with some regularity to rethink, what's cruel and unusual now. It's a true principle. How does it apply these days? So, to think about how Dworkin's argument works, the main sort of argument that Dworkin's making is, should we look to the legislative intent? One view says yes, that's the expectation intent view, or intentionalism. No, so we look to the semantic intent, or what Scalia called textualism, and Dworkin's going to say, we do not look to legislative intent. He agrees with Scalia, moreover, more in the kind of textualism type thing. What kind of rights do we get from the constitutional law? On one view, we get these dated rights, like the rights that they thought that the laws were giving us. That's Scalia's view, Dworkin thinks. Or we get these kind of abstract rights, like the right to avoid cruel and unusual punishment. That's the living constitutionalism, Dworkin thinks. And if we're trying to figure out, should we go with Scalia's view? Dworkin's kind of argument is that Scalia's view, the dated view of rights, is kind of like expectation intent, right? It's about what the people, when they made the laws, thought would happen as a result of their making the laws. And he thinks we shouldn't look to intent. For the same reason we shouldn't look to intent, we shouldn't have the dated view of rights. And so that view must be false if we reject the first expectation intent view. We've got to reject originalism too. And that gives us living constitutionalism. Okay, so that's Dworkin's argument. Scalia has a response to Dworkin's paper, and that's what we're going to look at next time.